Hello and welcome back to the Good Vibes Garage. This is Jess here. Today we are going to discuss how to cast a bouquet or any other sort of dried flower into resin. So, quick overview of my materials that I'm going to use today. Got my nitrile gloves for protection of my hands. You don't want to get any resin onto your hands. I also have some stir sticks that I'll be using to help mix the resin and catch any drips. I'm going to use these forceps to place the flowers in and out of the mold. I've got a disposable plate here just for cleanup and to put any extra sticks in. Some half paper towel sheets. I like to keep a stack of these around just for some quick cleanup. And then we've also got some disposable cups here. These are measuring cups, so I'm going to use these to mix the resin and pour the resin. These do have measurements in milliliters and ounces. And then for my materials for the actual resin itself, this is my mold release spray. So this is the Cast and Craft mold release. Really any mold release spray will do, but is nice to have around to help you towards the end of the project. And then I also have my mixer. This is the Let's Resin electric mixer. I used to do this resin mixing by hand. I have found that the hand mixer is a little bit easier, a little bit faster, and creates less bubbles in the end. For the resin, I have the Let's Resin epoxy resin for deep pour. This is the max pour depth of up to 2 to 4 inches. So I have parts A and B, which we'll be using to actually do the casting. For the mold, this is just an Amazon mold that I found online. It is a 4x4 inch cube, and this will be what we are casting the flowers into today. Before I get started, I want to heat up my resin so that it's a little bit easier to work with and it produces less bubbles. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put some warm water in this pot, and then we will just put our resin in a resin bath for about 15 minutes. My resin is sitting in the water bath. I'm going to do a couple things to prep the project. First, I'm going to put on my gloves. I'm just using regular black nitrile gloves, latex free. And then I'm going to take my mold. I have already pre-washed this. Definitely make sure you wash it out. I did not use soap. I just did a nice warm rinse and then a very good dry. Make sure you look closely and that there are not any extra drops of water inside your mold before you get started. So this is where I want to spray my mold release spray. So I'm going to take my spray and I'm just going to do a couple sprays on all sides of it. And then I'm going to take a microfiber cloth and I'm going to actually just wipe my spray around inside of the mold. Now that my spray is inside of the mold and we are good and clean, I'm going to do a double check to make sure that there's no obvious dust or any other drips from the mold release spray. Okay, I'm going to put my mold to the side for a minute. We'll come back to that when we're ready. And now I'm going to prep the flowers. These are the flowers that I'm going to be using today. I'll note that these have already been dried, so I'm not going to be drying them in the resin, but rather I'm putting dried flowers into the project. So make sure your flowers are completely dry. These were dried in silicone sand, so they came out pretty good. Still have quite a few layers in there, a little bit of sand on them, so I just kind of shake it off and then put the flowers in there. I found that the silicone sand really doesn't seem to affect any of the resin. So if you do dry flowers in silicone sand, I don't believe that that will be a problem. So I've got those flowers here, and I'm also going to use some foliage. So again, these were dried flowers from my wedding bouquet. And I'm going to do a little bit of cutting to make these into smaller pieces. Okay, to prep the flowers, I'm just going to take my flowers and my regular garden shears and I'm just going to cut some of the stems off. That way I have smaller pieces to work with when I'm putting these into the bouquet or into the resin mold. Okay, now I'm just going to kind of line some of these up on my foil. I like to take a look at some of the leaves and make sure there's not any that are too damaged or that have some dark spots. So I'm just going to pull these apart a little bit more and just kind of line these up in my prep zone. And again, you can do this however you want. You can make the pieces as big or as small as you would like. I like to do a little bit of both, and sometimes I end up breaking them apart even more once I'm actually pouring into the resin mold. A couple different size leaves here, a couple individuals. Just gonna line those up, sort these out a little bit, and make sure I've got just about everything I think I'll need for the actual mold. I'm going to get ready to mix the resin. So first I'm going to get out a couple different cups. The reason I'm mixing in multiple cups instead of a giant cup is because it does matter how many inches of resin that you have when you are pouring and how many ounces you can mix at a time. I will caution, if you are using a shallow pour instead of a deep pour, please listen to the instructions or read the instructions on the resin that you've purchased. The quantity does matter, and the resin will flash cure if you mix too much at a time. I definitely did that on accident once, so just a caution there. Make sure whatever your resin that you are using, make sure you read the instructions on your specific resin so that you can mix the appropriate amount. I'm going to make about 24 ounces. I'm going to use probably 4 different cups to do this since my ratio is 2 to 1 on this deep pour resin. And so I'm going to get a couple cups out. I'm going to use 3 of those for just mixing and pouring, and then I'm going to use this one, which is also an 8-ounce cup, but it's a little bit wider of a mouth. That way I can dip my flowers into this cup before putting them into my mold. The reason I'll be doing this is because the resin needs to tack onto the flowers before it can tack onto the resin that's actually inside of the mold. If you place the dry flowers in without dipping them into the mold, then you risk a lot more bubbles and a lot more air getting trapped underneath each leaf, which could cause breakage of your mold later, or just those air bubbles being trapped inside. Before I mix up the resin mold, I want to walk through the process just a little bit about how I'm going to get the flowers into this mold. I want to do this because the resin dries very quickly and you have really limited work time, so I want to explain just a quick process here. So once I get my resin mixed, I'll be taking this cup as my flower dipping cup, and I'll have these cups as my pouring cups. So I'm going to start out by pouring just a little bit of resin immediately into the mold, and then from there I need to start dipping. So I will take my dried flowers, I'll dip them into the resin cup, shake them off a little bit, and then just start placing them directly into my resin mold. Overall, your work time for my particular resin that I'm using is only about 30 minutes before it gets too sticky to where you cannot properly maneuver your flowers without damaging them. One thing that I learned from doing this a couple of times is that my dried flowers float. Because of this, I don't want to mix my mold, or I don't want to mix resin that will fill this mold all the way to the top. This will actually be a 2-part pour because I need to pour about 3/4 of the way with my flowers and my resin, let it sit for a couple of hours, about 4 hours for this type of resin, and then I'm going to do a final pour on top to seal off the entire project, and so I don't have any flowers that rise up to the top of my mold so they're uncovered. First I'm going to open up my 2-part, or my part A, and sometimes it can be a little tricky. All right, I'm just gonna open this up, put this in the bowl temporarily, and then you really want to get eye level with your cup just so you can have an exact pour. So I'm going to pour 4 ounces into a couple of these cups. All right, this is my part B. And the cap just kind of came off there. I'm going to pour 2 ounces into each of these cups. Or if I see that I've poured a little bit extra into each one, I'm going to do that same thing, pour a little bit extra here. And part 2 is much thinner, so it pours a little faster. Okay, let's get to mixing. Turn on my mixer. And this is just a spinner. All right, now that my resin's poured, I'm going to stick my electric mixer into the resin, and I'm going to set a timer for about 3 minutes for each one of these cups. Get it nice and mixed. You can do this by hand with a stir stick. It does tend to get a couple more bubbles down into your mixture and takes longer to stir, but it can be done. The resin that I'm using does ask that you let the resin sit for a couple of minutes once it's mixed so that the chemical reaction can begin to occur. So I like to start by mixing the dipping cup first, that way it can sit before I pour into my resin mold. I see a few swirls in my second cup that signals to me I didn't quite mix it well enough. So I'm going to jump back over here to this one, give it a stir for another few seconds, and then we'll be ready to go. Okay, now that my resin is properly stirred, I'm going to shake off my stir device just a little bit, and then I like to use a silicone spoon holder to set my resin mixer on. That way I can clean it at the end and not have to worry about the resin dripping off. Okay, now that my resin is mixed, I'm going to set this off to the side here. I'm going to prepare my resin mold, or take my prepared resin mold, and get ready to dip. So I'm going to be working pretty fast here because this is actively drying. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to take a little bit of my second cup, and I'm going to go ahead and pour it into my mold to give myself a base to start with. Just gonna pour just enough here. Doesn't really matter how much, this is up to you. I like to pour just a couple of centimeters and wipe this off. That way I have something to place the resin flowers in. Okay. I'm gonna set these off to the side and start to dip. All right, I'm gonna get started. I'm gonna take my leaves, my forceps. I'm going to dip this directly into this cup first. Once those have some resin on them, I can transfer that into my mold. And again, I'm doing this dipping process so that I can prevent bubbles from forming inside of the mold. Just going to kind of place that in there. I'm going to do this a couple of times. Going into this, I really don't have a lot of a plan, other than I just like my leaves to be facing outward or towards the edges of the mold. And I just like to move them around as I go. You can do this with as much or as little foliage as you like. I tend to prefer quite a bit of foliage just because this is a 4x4 mold, so it is pretty deep. So you've got a lot of space to work with and a lot of depth to work with. And I just like there to not be any gaps. I like to fill in the gaps. Sometimes you have to turn them a little bit to experiment with which way you like them to face. And sometimes they are not Sometimes your foliage does not like to cooperate, in which case that's okay too. I try to grab the foliage by the stem as best as possible. That way I don't put marks onto the leaves. As you can see, I'm kind of leaving a little bit of a space. I'm going to use some of these smaller pieces to fill in the middle space, but I'm really just building up the area for my primary flowers to sit on. These are quite delicate when they are dry, but once you get them in the resin, they kind of become more pliable again, so you can be a little less careful with how you're handling them. For this mold, I do have quite a few flowers to put in, but I want to build a decent base for those flowers to sit on so that my flowers are actually closer to the top. The front of my mold will be the top. The front of my finished project will be the top face of this, so I want to build up the base. A couple little guys and a couple little beads for good measure. The great part about working with foliage is that you can work pretty quickly with it, because it's okay if it's a little haphazard. It's art and it's trees. Okay, I'm going to save a couple of leaves here. Now I'm going to grab a flower. I do have my flowers sitting off to the side here. I'm going to take my dried flower. I'm going to try to grab it by the stem and do the best I can to dip this face down into my dipping cup. This doesn't always work super easily. Sometimes you have to grab it and flip it over. I'm going to just kind of shake it. And I am starting with my largest rose. So I'm going to flip it and grab a popsicle stick for support. I'm just going to kind of try and almost drop it in. And then do my best to angle it in here. Okay, I'm going to pick a little more off of this one. I'll be honest, I did not come in with much of a plan to this, so we're going for it. I believe I have enough room to do 3 large roses, so I'm going to try that. All right, now that all of my flowers are in, I'm gonna make sure I don't have any extra foliage tucked or touching the top. Just gonna clean this up a little bit, and I'm actually gonna tuck a couple more leaves down into the corners using my individual leaves. Okay, that is about all of the foliage I can fit in there. You do want to make sure that your foliage is lower than the top of your mold. Now that that is done, I'm going to take a paper towel and I'm just going to wipe off the edges of my mold a little bit where I dripped. It does not have to be super clean. I just like to do this so that later it doesn't cause spillover or a lump kind of attached to the side. And all I'm gonna do is I'm just going to do a little bit of a pour over, and I'm gonna try and pour down into the creases first. That way the resin can get into all of the different areas that are underneath that do not have resin in them yet. Use a popsicle stick to just scrape the edges, that way I can get as much as possible out of each cup. so that the resin, I'm also going to start pouring directly over the roses a little bit so that the resin can get into all of the different air pockets and the bubbles can start to rise. So right now I'm finishing pouring all of my resin into my mold. This was the last cup that I had mixed. I'm gonna get as much out as possible. And looking at the side of my mold, I'm only about halfway up. So I think I'm actually gonna mix 6 more ounces of resin to fill up my mold just a little bit more for the initial setting of the flowers. All right, so I'm about halfway up the side of my mold. So I'm going to mix up 6 more ounces. That way I can just set the flowers a little bit better inside of the mold. You can mix however much or as little as you want in the initial mixing. I would just caution that if you don't put all of your flowers in at the beginning, they'll become really difficult to work with later. So at this point, I'm pretty much not going to touch anything else inside of the mold. I'm just going to mix this up and pour it in. Okay, I'm going to let this sit for a couple minutes. While I do that, I will clean off some of my tools before the resin becomes too difficult to work with. I tend to just use paper towels for this, and I'll just grab my tool, grip my paper towel tightly around it, and just kind of wipe it off. I don't typically let the resin sit for very long after I start working with it, even though the instructions say to do so, so I'm just going to go ahead and pour. And again, I'm going to try and hit those corners and creases a little bit. And I'm going to try to hit some deeper areas of the flowers. I'm going to let some of these bubbles rise to the top over the next few minutes, and I'm just going to kind of poke at some of the bubbles. There are different tutorials out there that include using a heat gun to remove bubbles, but I personally don't mind having 1 or 2 bubbles in here, and I feel that the heat gun can actually melt your silicone mold and damage your flowers. So I like to do this by hand and just have a couple imperfections if that's what it takes. Overall though, I really don't find that you get too many if you can get your resin into the edges and the corners, and as well as down into your roses, letting those bubbles rise to the top and then kind of poking them instead of using a heat gun. You will get some bubbles that'll come to the top and pop on their own, but I try to take care of the big ones. I do try to take care to not touch the rose petals. They are extremely delicate. I have not actually touched any of these petals. This is just naturally from the resin, pulling some of the color off of the roses to make them have a little bit of a different texture. Okay, so my 30-minute timer is almost up. That means that my resin is going to become more and more difficult to work with. What I will do over the next 10 minutes or so is I'm going to keep a close eye on it and just let it sit on its own for a little while, and then come back and see if there's any more bubbles that I can pop. I'm also going to set a timer for about 4 hours, and I'll step away and come back and pour the remaining resin to the very top of the mold. You want to do this before the resin is completely dry. That way the resin sticks to itself, because the current resin will be kind of a tacky texture as opposed to completely dry. Now that I have my resin poured about 3/4 of the way to the top, I'm going to let this sit for about 4 hours, and then I'm going to come back and I will mix up a couple more ounces and pour those onto the top to finalize the pour. Okay, welcome back. It's been about 17 hours since I last checked on this, or since we made our first pour. I'm going to go ahead and look in here. I have checked this periodically over the last couple of hours to make sure there's not any bubbles. I do actually see one more bubble So I'm going to go ahead and try and pop that with my silicone scraper here. It looks like it's actually under a flower, so I don't think I'm going to be able to reach that one. But we are at a nice jelly, sticky, tacky consistency. You can see I can actually pull it and drag it and it becomes a little stringy. So because of that, I'm going to go ahead and make my last resin pour. We're going to mix up some resin here, and all we're going to do is just pour it straight in to top it off, all the way up to the top of this mold. Okay, I'm just going to open up my 2 parts. I'm going to do this exactly the same as I did yesterday. So we're going to do my 2-to-1 ratio here. I think I'm going to do probably 12 ounces, 6 in each cup. I did not take care to measure how much I've already used or how much my mold can hold. This might be something you want to do for yours, but I just like to wing it. Do 2 of these. You can do 4 ounces in each cup. Resin cups are mixed. I've got about 12 ounces here that I'm going to pour in. You can calculate a little more closely how much resin you have used and how much you need to fill up the rest of your mold, but I tend to just kind of wing it now since I have done this a couple of times. All right, and now I'm going to go ahead and pour it in. So I've got my mixed cup. I'm just going to kind of shoot for the open gaps and holes and kind of deeper areas where I can tell that there's not any resin. Just try and pour pretty slowly. And it really doesn't matter a whole lot, I suppose, on where you actually pour it in. I just try to make sure that you're getting an even layer. This resin is self-leveling, which is really, really great. So it does flatten out on its own for the most part, but I still try to pour the stream into some of the areas where I can see it needs it. All right, as I near the top, I'm going to get down eye level with my mold here so that I can make sure I don't overfill it. But I do want to pop a couple of these bubbles here. I'm going to look eye level with my mold as I pour the last bit in. I like to pour to where there's a slight dome at the top. I find that that gives you a smoother finish. Okay, I've got just a tiny bit left, so it looks like I measured pretty accurately. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to watch some of these bubbles pop up, and I'm going to try and get some of them with my silicone tool. And then I'm going to check back for about every couple hours for really the next 15 hours or so, probably really throughout the day here. I'm going to check back and pop any bubbles as they appear throughout the day, because they will continue to rise since we didn't cover the surface of the roses until today. So you will start to see quite a few bubbles come up. This is normal and expected. You may not be able to get every single one of them, but I do really try to get a lot of them as they rise up throughout the day. So as you might be able to tell, some of these are actually already popping on their own and rising up to the surface on their own. So now I'm going to cover it up and I'm going to leave it alone for a couple of hours, and then I'll check back here, and I'll continue to check back for about the next 15 hours or so and pop any bubbles as I see them until it becomes too solid to where I'll just have to leave anything else. So we will check back here later. This is the side view of my mold with the completely filled resin. All right, now that everything is poured, I'm going to watch this over the next couple of hours on and off, just letting the bubbles have time to rise, and then I'll come back and pop them. You might be able to see that there's quite a few right now. This is expected due to the amount of air that was trapped inside of each flower. So those should kind of automatically rise up on their own, and then I'm just using this completely silicone tool to just kind of poke at the bubbles and pop them by hand. The other thing I'm doing is I am going to go ahead and support the edges of my mold, really just with a cup or whatever object you might have lying around. This mold I have used before, so it's kind of starting to bow out at the edges due to the aggressiveness that you have to kind of get it out of the mold. So I'm going to get an object here and just kind of place it just right up to the edge so that it gives it just enough support to maintain a little bit of a straighter edge. This is optional on if you would like to do this or not, but I do like to do it on my molds just so you can get a little bit of a straighter edge. You can use bricks, you can use books, or really whatever you have laying around. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, and then I'm going to cover it up with my paper plate and leave it alone for a few hours.